Thank you for bearing with us with the delay. I just want to welcome everybody to this panel discussion today, really discussing human rights of water and where we started 10 years ago and where we still need to go. This is also coinciding with a report that we're releasing, which if you're in the room with us, it's on the table, and if not, please reach out via email to anyone in Community Water Center, and we can make sure you get a copy. Really explaining the work that we've done over the past 10 years, and again, so without further ado, we will start with letting our panelists introduce themselves.
Kyle, my name is Susana de Anda. I am the Executive Director and Co-founder of the Community Water Center, El Centro Comunitario por el Agua. I believe clean water is a basic human right and that should never be a privilege. Thank you for being here.
First, Department of Water Resources and Deputy Director of Solutions. Really excited to be a part of this all-female panel supported by Kyle. Something to think about as we get into things. In my role, I'm working at the department on the strategy side to really think through how we do this work. Making sure that our policies and procedures actually reflect the outcomes that we want to have for our communities. So we have a human rights water law. How does it apply to our work? I think that's really important for state agencies to think through and pull themselves from. So that's what I strive to do at DWR.
Hi, Laurel Firestone. I'm a member of the State Water Board, and prior to serving on the board, I have been privileged to be part of the movement that got the Human Rights Water Act passed, and working for water equity today, and co-founding Community Water Center with Susana. Spent, I would say, the first at least half of my career down in Tulare County, and then I've been up here since a decade as well.
Well, thank you all. Can maybe give a round of applause to our Great. Okay, so I kind of want to start with why, and maybe Susanna, you could help here. What was the situation on the ground? What were activists dealing with? And why was passing the Human Rights Water Law in 2012 so important to us?
Question. It's always the why. Why we created Community Water Center. The why is right here. It's the visual impact that we have and bringing it to us here. So the why is we have poor drinking water quality, going to old and dilapidated infrastructure, landing in people's tap water. So moms are having to open up tap water and worry that their children don't use the water or don't drink the water they use to brush their teeth because they can get sick. And the type of water contamination that we're seeing in the state is something to be concerned with. We're talking about primary contaminants like nitrates, arsenic. And we also have secondary contaminants, and we have it here. I have real samples, they're in the report as well. It's a quite famous display, but it's a display that we're going to continue to carry every day until we fix this problem and try to work it. So the type of water quality that we have, why is, a lot of families are faced with poor drinking water quality, but not only are the water quality itself a problem, it's not just a good information to make informed decisions that we see as a huge barrier to bring about change and to make informed decisions. So I'm going to hold down into Tulare County. Tulare County is where we started the movement, at least myself and my co-founder here, where we quickly realized that a lot of familias were taking some of the highest water for toxic water. And we looked at the water quality reports, and we were able to see that the system was providing water with high levels of nitrates, TCP, perchlorate, bacteria, E. coli, uranium. It goes on and on and on. And the question is, why are we allowing these systems to function in that manner? And that should be a question that we ask ourselves now. Why do we allow these systems to provide unpotable drinking water to residents? And then on top of that, residents were paying twice for water, for a toxic water bill, and still have to get alternative water supply just to have safe drinking water in their home. And that was the narrative we kept hearing community after community. And so the reason why we co-founded Community Water Center was to bring about change and to leverage resources to ensure that every Californian can drink tap water without the fear of becoming sick. And in merit, more than a campaign, in merit, we needed to create a movement and create a nonprofit and to leverage resources to bring about change. In Tulare County, as we were discovering this reality, we also read a lot of reports that frankly are still shocking. The Tulare County General Plan of 1970 had a policy that actually said that there were 16 communities to have no authentic future, and therefore the county was not going to invest public funding into these communities. So it was no coincidence that they were implementing this policy. In the 16 communities that were outlined, we doored on it. And the story was very similar. People were not drinking tap water because they were afraid of it, but they didn't know why they should not drink tap water. It was just fear. Because people were getting sick. So we would, residents would ask me, Susana, do you think that's why so-and-so died of cancer? Do you think that's why so-and-so lost their baby? And I can tell you this, I am not a doctor, but there's plenty of studies that show that if you're drinking high levels of nitrates, you can get sick. You can have the blue baby syndrome, you can also get cancer. So the reality is we can't continue to expose residents to live in this reality. And today, 2023, as we're celebrating the human right to water, I'm here to tell you that we still have a long way to go. We still have to ensure that residents have access to good information, one. Two, that we have access to good resources to bring about change, so that we have interim and long-term strategies. And that these policies, at least locally in Tulare County, when we had this general plan, it actually gave me the roadmap to go organize in these communities that we seem to have in the future. But that gives you a sense of structured racism. It's a structured system that's kept some communities from having safe drinking water and others having safe drinking water. It is no coincidence that if you look like me and you live in the Central Valley, you're gonna have higher chances of having contaminated water and having to face some of the highest water rate from toxic water that can get you sick. That's called injustice. That's racism. That's an environmental injustice that we need to change that narrative. So the follow-up question you have is, why was the human right to water so important? It was the best organizing tool to galvanize a movement, to talk about the problem that we were seeing in our communities, and to bring attention to this issue that many families to this day don't have safe drinking water. And that's a problem. And it's not okay to realize that these systems are providing unpotable drinking water when we allow that because we want to continue to increase water rates. And guess what? We need to have fair rates and we need to have good drinking water. And we need to have the right resources to bring about change. So when we initiated human rights to water, 1242 Ruskin was the original law that did not pass through the governor because he was afraid that we would open up the seat for liability and lawsuits. And that's why we didn't pass it. But as consistent and persistent organizers, we were able to manage to pass AB 685. And that really is helping us change the narrative in California to say we have a problem that we need to address and bring relief to, so that we ensure that everyone, no matter where you live, what zip code you live at, can drink tap water without the fear of becoming sick. And that it's a choice if you want to buy alternative water supply and not forced to have to do that.
Susanna. Laurel, I think maybe I'll ask you next. Susanna kind of mentioned that part of the passing of human rights water was really make sure that in Sacramento, there was attention to this issue, that this is something people were focusing on. And maybe because you've been on both sides of the issue, you can describe how is the passage of the law and implementation of the human rights water law address how the water board is prioritizing drinking water in Spanish communities in California.
Great, yes. I think one of the most fundamental things that the Human Rights Water Act did was establish a explicit requirement on all state agencies, including state water board and Department of Water Resources, to consider how the water needing further the human water or impacted otherwise. And I would say the law has literally changed shift in ownership. Prior to the Clean Water Act, the State Water Board didn't have the Division of Drinking Water. The Division of Drinking Water was over a completely different agency, and we didn't have specific funding for drinking water solutions. And overall, I think in the state and certainly at the board, there just wasn't awareness of the hundreds on an ongoing basis. So I think there's a piece of just education. There's some structural change that happened in terms of moving Division of Drinking Water over. So we now are an agency that is responsible for protecting water from source to tap and integrating all of that. And then over time, and I know we'll talk about this, advocates and the legislature and leadership in the administration have given us the tools to really start addressing some of these core structural and resource issues that are needed to really realize the human right to water in California. It's not something that you can just pass along magically of fantastic drinking water. It's really the foundation of building all of the tools and momentum and awareness, priority, resources to achieve safe and affordable drinking water for all.
Thank you, Laura. And beyond that, you recently led the development of the department's own human drinking water policy. How do you envision that policy and human drinking water affecting DWR's work?
I would say similar to the water board's journey, I think this law did create a shift in mindset, and in the development of this policy, it was necessary for DWR to take it one step further. I think my interpretation of this law is it's a firm commitment to a baseline that we must achieve and adhere to. But I think the real challenge sometimes is how do you implement? How do you apply it to your work, your programs, projects? And this policy strives to create more clarity inside our department on what that means. How do we engage with community members? How do we make sure they're part of the development of our programs to ensure outcomes? We actually did interview the state board and learn from you all how your entire mission changed and felt the necessary replication that we needed to create a policy that kind of echoed that change. And so what I would say is, it's led to us rethinking a lot of our big strategic documents. So with this policy in place, we are requiring our strategic plan to be changed to think through equity, environmental justice principles. Last summer, we created a racial equity action plan. We're getting our mindset in a space that is evolved, but also through documentation of our biggest strategic planning documents, enforcing, holding ourselves accountable to the outcomes that we achieve. And I think something that's really important in this piece, Susanna mentioned this, is this access to resources and information. And part of this policy isn't just about holding access to water, affordability to water, clean, safe water. It's also about how we inform members of the public of the resources and information that we as the state provide to them. And I think that is our unique value add. We sit in this position where we can see the data across the board. We can pull resources to provide and build that gap that a lot of communities can't do those assessments of understanding their own challenges and lead them to tap the state resources. So I just think that there's this interesting theme in both of our state departments where we needed to operationalize this. This law states our mission, our charge. But then how do we ensure that state agencies and departments are actually applying it to the work? I think that's really this next phase that we're entering into. And I think we really need the help of members of the legislature, our NGO partners, to help us inform and hold us accountable to this process. One final thing I'll just say about this policy, just to give maybe a call out to my own entity. It's the first time environmental justice is referenced in our entire administrative policy. And I say that just as a reflection of where we are, and as Susanna pointed out, there's a lot more work that needs to be done. You know, that's my personal passion, where I think it's important to know where we are and move forward with that. And so just wanted to share that. Maybe it's not so fun, but we're working.
Thanks, Bianca. That's great to hear how all these agencies have implemented the human rights of water. From a policy perspective, I want to get a little bit more into the details of how this is actually moving out. I think Laurel mentioned the water board has the ability to help deliver solutions, but obviously there's challenges in that process. And you're now in a unique position where we have so much funding from the federal government. There's a lot of state resources for development of drinking water solutions, and we have access to the newly established SAFER program, which is getting dollars out the door to communities. How is it? Could you describe it? Most work has been shifting to for traditional infrastructure funding to now work to prioritize the underserved communities, and why is it so difficult to get solutions in underserved communities from the board's perspective?
So I'm not sure, I think I'll start actually with the basics. I don't know how, I know there's a lot of folks here that have differing levels of experience with communities, but we have about over 7,000 different public water systems that we regulate in the state. Just under 3,000 are communities. And then we have hundreds of schools that are their own water system, where they're responsible for treating, maintaining, providing water to people on an ongoing basis that meets the basic standards of the Safe Drinking Water Act. About 75% of those are under 1,000 connections. So that means they have under 1,000 homes, many times a couple hundred homes, that are the rate base for paying for ongoing operation of those systems, which have to meet rigorous safety standards, and now are even more challenged in the drought in terms of water supply. Many of the communities rely on a single well, so if one thing happens to that well, they can be without water altogether, or only having contaminated water. We have over 300 communities that are unable to meet safe drinking water standards on an ongoing basis. Almost all of those are very small. 90% of them are under 500 connections, and primarily in low income and communities of color. And in fact, race is one of the largest predictors of, as on the side of access to safe drinking water and sanitation. But in terms of challenges, we are starting with the challenge of having a huge number of agencies that are very small, have very little financial capacity, because you've got a small number of low-income residents that have a limit on how much they can afford to pay in rates, and can't afford things like, for example, an ongoing operation of a arsenic treatment plant. In the community of Lanier, for example, they were able to get through the county, not us, arsenic treatment plant funded without doing any kind of economic feasibility study. We would have done that, but they didn't. And so they built $1 million treatment plant. They couldn't afford to run it. It's now mothballed, and the community is in massive debt and in receivership. So just having funding for solutions is not alone going to, in some ways, it can leave communities worse off than than if there weren't the investments to begin with. We're also, there's a huge, as Susanna said, very explicit history and in reality of disinvestment, withholding funds from areas in addition to lack of capital through their own financing. There's many communities that never got centralized water systems at all. So you have households that are in high density areas, but each one is reliant on a single domestic well, which are usually shallow and unregulated. And especially that's where we're seeing really the most risk from drought and overdraft. And then there's been just extreme consistent dynamics of exclusion of many of the areas that are without safe drinking water are in urban areas or right next to cities, but cities have refused to connect to them because of historic racism or continued discrimination and feeling like seeing that community as a liability or a strain on their own limited water supplies. So even when the state has fully funded or offered to fully fund consolidations to merge in low-income communities into existing cities and larger systems, communities that refuse to do it until we use what we just have a relatively recent authority where we can force consolidation. And even then, there's been a lot of resistance and legal challenges to do that, even just helping your neighbors if the project's fully funded. We're really trying to shift that, and we have seen a number of consolidations now starting to happen. I'm really optimistic. We have about 250 consolidations in the works. We have 95 that have happened just since SAFER started. And we're seeing a lot of response from agencies, mostly regional agencies that are taking advantage of the financial incentives we're offering. We're not just paying for the cost of consolidations and that larger communities are having to fund the smaller community to come to merge in, but also providing extra incentives for their own projects. Like, do you need a storage tank? We've got some funding for you. So we've been really trying to make sure that this is something that everyone's seen in their best interest and furthering resiliency. Just a couple more things on SAFER. One of the bits of the program that was passed and by the legislature, signed by Governor Newsom right when Governor Newsom started in 2019. And it's really a shift from communities coming to funding programs or funding programs waiting for communities to come to us, waiting for applications to come to us, and just funding based on who has a consultant that can write the best application. Instead, it's saying who are the communities most in need. We're going to do an annual needs assessment to identify which communities are failing, which are at risk. We're going to provide targeted technical assistance. We're providing technical assistance for over 500 communities right now to make sure that they are developing the solutions that then we can fund. And then we're prioritizing funding, including the federal and state bond and general fund infrastructure funding that we have, state revolving fund. But I think importantly, this flexible funding of 130 million annually that's coming in through the state of Global Drinking Water. That flexible funding has enabled us to not just do these sorts of technical assistance pieces, but also covering things like operations and maintenance as we're moving to more sustainable solutions, emergency funding for interim solutions as it takes, even if in the best of scenarios, it takes a couple years to get a major infrastructure project in place. And I think trying to make sure that we're using, again, these new authorities around administrators, mandatory consolidation to break through some of these hardest communities. Many of the times where we're seeing communities that have gone decades without safe drinking water, it's because we're hitting these walls with local resistance and having tools in the state to push through that. I think is why I'm optimistic in seeing some of these communities actually get safe drinking water after decades. One last flag, I know, it's just the Safer Fund is going to be sunsetting in 2030, and so we are going to be needing to look for a more sustainable funding source going on, especially as we're seeing, hundreds of communities at risk, and even more now because of water supply challenges. And so there's just, I think, a continued need to really focus on the important state program.
Thank you, Laura. That was really helpful. And I think when we talk about ongoing supply issues, that really, I think, resonates with the fact that we're in a drought, we're in a long-term drought, and there's long-term groundwater resources on the bottom. We're kind of at a critical point with the implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And this is a new role, I think, for DWR to regulate rather than focus on the more engineering side of things. So how is DWR approaching this point in time with SGMA and with the human drinking water in mind?
Kyle, yeah, I totally agree. New role for DWR, and I think I would say it's an opportunity to expand our thinking. I don't know how familiar folks are in this group with SGMA legislation, so I'll just kind of give you a quick little rundown. But some important historical context is California was the last Western state to actually regulate its groundwater. And I think that's pretty significant as you think about its implementation, because in so many things, California is typically known as the national leader in a lot of our focus environmental work. And for this to be one of the last books to take action on this is interesting. And I think that complexity that we're dealing with. A key component of this law is that it's not necessarily the responsibility of the state to play an oversight on it. It's really on the locals, known as groundwater sustainability agencies, to develop these long-term plans to bring the groundwater basins into sustainability over a 20-year period. So, I think this is a neat law in that it's projecting for a significant period of time in the context of climate change, which is rapidly accelerating. And even in this past year, we've experienced heat events, extreme heat events, long-term, the drought is worsening. We've also experienced energy crisis, recent winter storms. All of those things are critical in thinking in the long-term strategy of how these GSPs, groundwater sustainability plans, come to be, how we actually maintain sustainability in the long term. So, with us providing regulatory oversight, there is also a role that the state board does play in this legislation. If necessary, if the sustainability goals are not being met, the state board does play its role as kind of a state intervener. To get those plans, those GSAs back on track to meet those goals. And when it comes to human right to water, I just want to say very clearly that DWR does consider human right to water in the implementation of this legislation. And specifically, I would say that the establishment of sustainable management criteria in each of the GSPs, they must consider all groundwater beneficial uses and users. I think what's important to note, and we're seeing this play out in real time, is there's a lot of internal conflict amongst these regions, whether it's between small community residents, ag, business, I think it's important to note that this law protects all uses and users. And so I just wanted to make that clear today. And in our process of regulatory oversight, if there are any uses or users that are missing in the consideration, we are asking GSAs to explain how they will correct that in the GSP. And how this will impact those users. And also, as part of those call outs, we do encourage GSAs to develop drinking water mitigation programs if groundwater levels will continue to lower based on your GSP mitigation. Right now, DWR is actively working with our NGO partners, and we're developing a water guidance and toolkit that will suite of tools for GSAs to incorporate into their plans, because I think a good regulatory role is to also provide the technical assistance and support to help locals get to that sustainability problem. And lastly, I would say DWR is pushing GSAs to work more closely with their counties through long-term drought plans, long-term groundwater management. And we provided them with a number of tools along the way and best management practices for knowledge engagement, translation services available to GSAs. Also, as part of a recent executive order, developed drinking water principles and strategies to ensure equity. And lastly, we created a dry well tool and a dry well susceptibility tool. And what's so great about those tools is it helps us get a real understanding of the pulse of domestic wells that are going dry across the state. And with the other tool, the dry well susceptibility tool, that's a predictor. So it provides, based on the information that's coming into the dry well reporting tool, we are then able to predict the risk or susceptibility for well going dry based on future hydrology projections. So those are two big important tools that we use not only to understand the problem, but also to dictate funding allocations as this administration considers new resources to allocate. And I would just say one challenge with that we've experienced is we assume that there's a lot of under-reporting of dry wells. So a lot of the information that we as the state have access to is, relying on volunteers and some of our NGO partners to report that information. But without really knowing and understanding the true scope of the problem, it becomes difficult to advocate for that within an administration or the legislature. And so we are encouraging folks to continue to update that information. But I would just say, it's important to think about SGMA as an iterative process. DWR at multiple checkpoints will be reviewing plans for meeting their sustainability goals on an annual basis, and then again in every 5-year check-in. So we see it as our role to continuously uphold the right to water and push towards progress in meeting that ultimate goal in 2030.
Thank you, Bianca. Bianca mentioned there's a 20-year timeline for SGMA. What hope or what needs are there on the ground for communities to have these drinking water issues with groundwater addressed?
Thank you for this question, Kyle. I just want to kind of back up and say the human right to water was really passed on the back of the movement that doesn't have safe drinking water. And that was a policy of the state 10 years ago that was signed into action and failed to deliver on that dream for many Californians today. And then that's a foundational for policy. And then we said, part of what we're missing is targeted funding to bring about change. So that SAFER was passed in 2019. To have targeted funding for our communities to have interim and long-term solutions, as Laura talked about. And then in addition to that, recognizing that over 90% of Valley residents rely on groundwater, we needed to have a resource to protect our groundwater sources from pollution and to have access to them. So then SGMA was developed, and we were a strong proponent and supporter of this law to ensure that we would deliver on the human right to water by protecting our primary source of drinking water, which is groundwater. So for us, Sigma needs to be implemented in a way that ensures that communities will and that are accounted for right now and for the future. If Sigma is not planned in that direction, we will have complete genocide in our communities. And I think it's really important to recognize that when we talk about local control, local power, and give a lot of deference to that, that's okay, but who are we giving that deference to? What is that local control made up of? What kind of knowledge do they have? What expertise are they lacking? And I'm here to tell you that the regions that we're working in, team, the GSAs are not composed of residents or people that are gonna have a better understanding to ensure that communities are accounted for right now, much less for the future. So we're seeing a lot of plans that currently are not considering drinking water quality, which is a big problem. So we need to have supply and good water quality. Number two, we're seeing a lot of plans that are not taking into consideration a lot of the domestic wells that we have. And if we're not accounting for that, that means a lot of people are not gonna have. So once again, a lot of these plans are failing the human right to water if we don't reject them. And if we don't ensure that the human right to water is for all Californians to have. If not, then the question is, the human right to water is for who? When it comes to Sigma. So I really do believe that Sigma is a tool that will help us deliver on the human right to water. It is made up of a diverse set of groups that really understand the importance of including community needs right now. And the beneficial uses right now. But it's not just for over extraction, for agriculture. That in addition to that, we also need it for drinking water. And if groundwater is over 90% the primary drinking water source for our valley residents, then we need to protect that. And we need to protect it so that people have access to that and that it's safe to drink. We're failing drastically on that. So when I talk with our residents, we talk about Sigma, if it's implemented the wrong way, we feel ashamed passing such law that once again is going to give good water to some people and leave someone else out of it again. So Sigma is critical. We need to be on top of that, and we do want to make a call to action to agencies like EWR and the State Water Board that we do have a responsibility to ensure that you work with local control to review these plans and to reject them if they don't have all the right components that they need to have to implement Sigma. Because we have real concerns with that. And as Laura alluded to, a lot of the work that we have around consolidation and funding, it all goes back to humans being critical barriers to change. And so we need to make sure that we're providing leadership and capacity and understanding on how we need to implement these laws. Because right now, but we're losing some of our movements that have been the drivers asking for right to water, that have been the drivers of Sigma, that have been the drivers of safer, but we're losing them, and they're not living a day waking up drinking tap water without the fear of becoming sick because they pass on. So there is a sense of urgency. So while we have more resources and these tools, I just want to also highlight that we this shit and we have a sense of urgency to drive change strategically, because I understand that money is part of the solution, but it's how we use this money and how we approach that that ultimately is going to bring about the lasting change.
Thank you, Susanna. Laurel, just back to you real quick. You know, we talked a lot about resilience and the work being done to provide safe drinking water. You mentioned how this could affect, water rates, and that everything we do has a cost. How is the state board able to ensure that residents across California are not forced to choose, like the example you said in Lanier, between water that is unsafe to drink or water that is affordable for residents?
Yeah, so water rates have risen far more than other utilities, far more than inflation. And if we look at the investments needed for water resiliency, as you said, Kyle, at least tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions, which even with really robust and state federal funding, which we need to subsidize, is mostly going to fall. So this is an issue no matter where you live, whether you have safe water or not. in the next few years, we're gonna see water rates skyrocket. And we do not have the tools that we need in this state to be able to address that. We saw with the pandemic a huge increase in the amount of debt that water customers were going into. The legislature passed a really significant package to forgive debt through a COVID period, but since that COVID period has ended, the debt has just continued to pile on, and we need to make sure that we're not waiting until customers are at risk of shut off or leaves on their homes, but that we find an approach to make water affordable as we move forward into this new climate reality. There are programs in all other utilities, basically, for low-income customers. There isn't one at the state level for water or wastewater, but there's also barriers around just local systems creating more equitable water rates, and that's with Prop 218 and Prop 26, limitations on public water systems being able to develop customer assistance programs without getting challenged in the courts. And so, as we look forward as this next chapter of the human right to water and our climate reality, I think affordability is going to be top of the list of things that we need to address, and water rate equity is going to be something that we have to do.
Okay, thank you. And then we have time for one more question. And I would be a terrible advocate if we get this done. So reflecting on everything that DWR, the State Water Board, and the progress we made on the human rights of water, what's going to be the next steps for the next 10 years to move the needle and push towards making the human rights of water reality?
So there's a couple of things I think that we need to think about for the future. One, I think we need to limit overpopulated groundwater. We have some major users that are using a lot of our water, dewatering our communities. So big agriculture uses a lot of water, and they have deep wells. They're competing with large straws with our communities, and that's a huge problem. So we need to be mindful of overpumping. We also need to be mindful of when we restrict usage of surface water and we return to groundwater. Keep in mind, again, there's competition for groundwater when a lot of our residents only rely on groundwater. We don't have access to surface water. So be mindful of these changes. Secondly, I think that the human right to water dilutes the sanitation team. So we need to extend SAFER. We need more funding for SAFER, and we need funding to include wastewater resources as well. The human right to water addresses sanitation, but yet we've done very little traction around that. So we need to really push that forward, and we need more funding for that. In addition to that, as Laurel mentioned, we need to create a low-income rate assistance program team. Water rates they're already, they're going to continue. It is our job to create a system to provide relief for residents and have an affordable rate. Our residents say, Susanna, I'll pay more if that means I'm going to have safe drinking water. This is what our families are saying. So even our own base is willing to pay more to have safe drinking water. But our responsibility as agencies and NGOs and activists is to have a fair water rate for everyone. And I think secondly, I will say this, I think it's important that we also look at polluter pays. A lot of the water contamination that we see is man-made. So I think those of us that are polluting should be responsible for causing that contamination. Nitrates is one good example of that too. 3 major sources that can contribute to nitrate contamination. Chemical fertilizer, what are we known for in the state? Growing a lot of food. That's if we call it food. But the way we grow food is pretty intense. But we spray a lot of chemical fertilizers and leads into nitrate contamination. The second biggest source is animal manure. I come from a county where we have more cows than humans. Clear County. Dairies contribute to horrible air and water contamination. Horrible. And the third source of nitrogen pollution is leaky septic tanks. Again, we need to address that as part of the human rights of water. So we need to leverage more resources to make sure that safer goes beyond 2030, and then we bring in more funding for that as well.
Well, thank you, Susanna. And now we have a little bit of time if folks, anyone in the audience want to ask anything.
Well, I mentioned one thing that, makes is about, local city not always being willing to, combine with our agencies for need of support, and I'm wondering if there are other instances, that you run into issues like local control and, the city either not being willing to work together or being willing to give some help that really cause problems in the processes that you're trying to do.
Yeah, there are a number of cases, and I know, people here have worked on communities like Bill and East Rosie, where it's very clear they're right next to the city. And the city or water system that's larger, that does have safe water, that's continuously refused to connect them. Both of those we now need to utilize our tools around, mandatory consolidation triggers, and then really generous incentives to try and accelerate that over the finish line. But it's a lot more complicated when there's communities that are a little more geographically isolated. And that's an area where we need to be looking at kind of managerial consolidation. It may be that you can't physically interconnect a pipe, but can you create an entity that creates the economies of scale? And then lastly, I'll just mention, this is not just a San Joaquin Valley or rural community issue. In the middle of LA, we've got a lot of tiny systems, and ones that are failing or at risk, and haven't had capacity. Some of you may have heard of Sativa. We had to do an administrator there, and Alf has been a leader in this area. We have a lot of tiny little mutuals that serve a tiny fraction of the tiny city in the middle of LA. So this is something that, looking at how we enable consolidations to happen when people don't want to work together, it's just a fundamental challenge. It's sort of a human challenge. And, I do think we now have more tools than we ever have before, but it's still making it happen on the ground that it's going to be the challenge and what we'll need to see. Thank you. Al wants to.
So technical assistance, but then I like all three of you talk about Sigma and safe drinking water. And you talk about different ways that it comes up, governance versus requirement, what's the plan? Can you give us some sense of how could legislatively do something that ensures that safe drinking water is a central part of what the signal plan is trying to address? Maybe not in this, but maybe the next 5 years or something. Ideas on how do we incorporate safe drinking water into signal.
Safe drinking water is already Sigma. I'll just reiterate that certainly, as Bianca said, and as we're looking at our goal, critically, we have to be assessing whether a plan is sustainable by whether you're actually ensuring people have access to water to drink in their homes. So I think that's part of the assessment now. One of the pieces I think that will be helpful is what is being done now in DWR is developing schools, and there's the legislature has enacted 552 around trying to make sure that small communities are identifying and counties are identifying where there's communities at risk for water shortage and what those plans and preparation are to prevent the wells in communities from going dry in drought and water shortage times. Having a better awareness and mapping and actual plans and programs in place will mean that, you know, as we move through Sigma, we will be working together on the ground to make sure, and with state agencies to make sure that we're preventing wells from going dry before they do. But you know, I think we will see we'll see huge challenges in the years ahead. I don't think there's any question. And one of the things we're going to be grappling with is that, you know, we've had thousands of wells go dry, and many are still dry even from the last drought. And just being able to drill wells to replace those that have gone dry is very difficult and hasn't been happening at the pace that we need it to. And as a result, we're just going to be continuing to haul water to communities for years and years until we get it.
And Bianca, you use the word encourage, so I'd love to know, can we help you do more than encourage?
Yes, our deputy director for Sigma, Paul Boston, has probably got the latest pulse on that exact piece, but I would say we are planning to roll out some decisions, I believe, the next week on some GSPs. So I think maybe you'll stay tuned. You'll get to see whether we upheld that or not. I did want to follow up on Laurel did mention for SB 502. I wanted to make a plug really quickly that we have recently launched the DRIP Collaborative, which is essentially an interagency drought and water shortage task force. This is a critical vehicle and pathway for all beneficial users to come forward and participate, and we're seeking applications now or interest forms is actually what we're looking for through the 24th of February. So I just wanted to share that that's an important vehicle you can share within your networks to make sure that we get representation across all of our users. But I would also say within the regulations, to your question, when it states human right to water, it says must consider human right to water. Again, similar to the analogy I drew with human right to water law and the policy that we implemented at DWR, I think there could be more clarity that could support the states upholding in that, meaning that, you know, Paul poking me, more clarity provides us more authority to make a decision that would be in line with what's the actions I'm sure today. And I think that vagueness there, must consider, is what's hung up and would potentially lead to legal challenges within the GSAs themselves, not necessarily our interpretation of it. So I think that is where the challenge lies, that piece. And I think what I would recommend is to connect with us and further those conversations and we put together a truth on that.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, well, that we are at time. Thank you so much, everyone. Can I get a round of applause?